Anthony Furey, columnist, Post Media. Welcome, Mr. Furey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to speak at today's session. I'd like to begin by stating that I'm here as an individual, speaking in my capacity as a newspaper columnist. I'm not here as an official representative of Post Media. My comments today will focus on the sections in Bill C-97 that concern the new tax measures designed to support Canadian journalism. I will not be speaking about what I think is the ideal relationship between government and media. The answer is none at all, but on how to best move forward with what is already on the table. So this small section of the legislation, as you may have seen, has already caused controversy coming from both regular Canadians and individuals within the media. Canadians are wary of the idea that their government would in some way favor, influence, or direct the media. And not only are media professionals, so it seems, wary of this happening, they are also concerned by the mere perception that this is happening. These concerns are mostly valid, and I share them. Last November's fall economic update was not only when support for journalism was first announced, but also when the accelerated capital cost allowance for businesses was introduced. Now, later in the week after that came out, I wrote a column that this latter move was to be applauded. And then I faced accusations of only backing the capital cost allowance measure because that same day I had also been bought off by the current government. Now, as someone who does not typically face such an accusation, I concluded that if it can happen to me, it most certainly can and will happen to everyone else in my field. As such, I would like to make 3 recommendations about how to proceed with these tax measures in a way that minimizes both the perception and the reality of politicizing Canadian media. Now, these measures have become popularly known as the media bailout. The public is under the impression that the government is simply doling out $595 million to media outlets on a mere whim. They may not know that the main measure is in fact a 25% labor tax credit for news media employees. My first recommendation is that a better job can be done in communicating what is going to happen. If the impression is left to linger that the government is forking over cash grants to their journalist buddies, trust in media will only plummet further. Now, there are many ways this can be done. Even a simple tweet from the Prime Minister, as we've learned, can have a great influence in informing public perception. But let's get more technical. There's the question of how to determine what organizations will be eligible for the tax credit. Now, the film industry has for decades had a similar tax credit. To be eligible for the federal film credit, one simply needs to spend 75% of your costs in Canada and check off any 6 out of 10 eligibility boxes. There is no politician or board or panel that determines eligibility. It is an administrative exercise. Whereas when it comes to the media credit, the government, to quote, will establish an independent panel of experts from the Canadian journalism sector to assist the government in implementing these measures, including recommending eligibility criteria. I would much sooner be judged by 10 strangers than I would 10 journalists. And I imagine many other journalists feel the same way about me. Additionally, I take issue with the notion of an independent panel. One of my favorite phrases in politics is fast becoming, there's nothing more partisan than an independent. Canadian arts grants at all levels of government are typically awarded by a jury of their peers. It is a fact that this process is considered both political and also rife with petty personal drama. The administration of the film tax credit, by comparison, as they're both in the broader arts community, though, is a much less divisive approach. So my second recommendation is to abandon this panel of journalism experts. Instead, I recommend the government allow as many voices as possible to present their opinions and that a basic checklist of qualifications be determined out of that. This avoids creating a gatekeeper system dominated by a few and brings it more to be an administrative measure rather than selecting criteria year by year. My last recommendation is a technical point, but I believe if not addressed, it can have troubling ramifications. The budget refers to an eligible recipient of the tax credit as a qualified Canadian journalism organization. This phrase has given the impression that the government is determining what is and what isn't a legitimate news organization. This phrase ought to be abandoned. Like with any tax credit, if you are eligible, you receive it. If you are not, you don't. There is no need for an official list, and there is no need for that list to be posted online in any capacity. Those are my 3 recommendations. Thank you, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Furey, and thank you for all your presentation. We'll go to 5-minute rounds and then over to Mr. Poilievre. Mr. Poilievre.
Yes, my questions relate to the budget's measures on journalism. The government claims that it can protect independent media by making media dependent with a $500 million package. Mr. Furey, you mentioned the existence of this so-called independent panel that will determine the criteria of eligibility for the various measures in the budget. There are actually two bodies that are going to decide who gets what. There is this independent panel, independent in quotation marks, of course, selected by the government. But then there's also a body. The term body is used in the legislation, which will not decide the criteria, but actually pick the individual news agencies that qualify under the criteria. No officials were able to tell us who will be part of this body, whether it's an existing agency of the Government of Canada, or whether it's a new one, whether it will be public servants or governor and council appointments. We have no idea who this body is, even though the tax credit and the tax benefits that it will dole out are already in effect as of the beginning of this year. Does it worry you at all as an independent journalist that a so-called body within the government will decide which news outlets qualify for taxpayer funds?
Certainly it worries me, and I have no more insights into exactly how this will unfold and the details of it than anyone else, particularly obviously those officials who you referenced. And I think a lot of people in the media industry would like to know the details of how this is going to unfold and would probably prefer to be consulted in advance of all of this being devised. As I said in my opening statement, if this is simply a tax credit to be administered, which I believe is typically how anybody, any sort of tax attorney, any sort of accountant would think of a tax credit, then fine. But this seems to be a different sort of animal, a sort of quasi-granting operation as opposed to strictly just a tax credit. Hence my recommendation that we need to do everything we can to turn it more towards administering this on as sort of basic a set criteria. Either you fulfill it or you do not, and leave it at that. And whoever is sort of employed is simply the individuals in government administering that program, as opposed to being some sort of board or panel, etc.
Thank you. The blacklocks.ca, which does a lot of access to information requests, reported this today. Federal agencies will publish an A list of newspapers and websites deemed reliable under a multi-million-dollar subsidy program. The Department of Finance yesterday told Senate National Finance Committee subsidies to federally approved news media invite government meddling in a free press, cautioned one senator. End quote. I mean, reading that, I feel like I've just cracked open a dusty old copy of 1984. Federal agencies will publish an A list of newspapers and websites deemed reliable under a multi-million-dollar subsidy program. Subsidies to federally approved news media. Federally approved news media. Like the adjectives that load the noun should send shivers down all of our spines. Do you expect you'll be on this A list?
I don't know if individuals will be on it, and I can't speak for my organization, but I think a lot of people don't like the idea that there's a list, as I referenced, the Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization, or I'm not sure specifically which list that story is referring to, but for those that get the not-for-profit status and the status where they will get tax charitable status, there will be some sort of list that says which are approved to receive that charitable status. I mean, if you're talking about listing registered charities, okay, that's already a thing that's done online, and if it's somehow compatible with that, then fine. But any sort of separate list that is on a government website saying these are the qualified Canadian journalism organizations, that's a problem. As I said in my remarks, to get any tax credit that's out there for your family, for your business, and so forth, you don't go onto a government list. You just file for it. Your accountant files for it, and you either qualify or you do not. So I think the idea of abolishing any sort of public list is the right direction to head. And year over year, the people who are recipients of these tax credits, like any other tax credit that exists, or at least the bulk of them, that is what happens.